Okay, folks, let's get it on, shall we? The front forks are lowered 1.5 inches. Now it's time to move to the back. Now, there's always a question, like if you were to call, well, how do I do this? Every bike has a different ratio for its leverage for the linkage, and so one amount of spacers used on one bike may not match that which is for another bike. So in every case you have to do it in this method that I'm going to show you to ensure that the amount of limited travel is what you want. Okay, so this takes into account different rocker lever ratios of your linkage down below. You guys all know what I'm talking about. So what you're going to do is you're going to start out finding an arbitrary number that's going to be your base point. So you're going to measure from the same place every time. I just used a piece of masking tape right here and put it on the fender. These fenders are so hammered you could probably just write right on the fender. It's all good. And then you're going to take a tape measure. Now you can use a sag tool if you want to, but basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure. It's easy for me to measure from the bottom of the axle nut, or not the nut, but the actual axle bolt. And it doesn't really matter. It's just more reproducible for me than the center of the axle hole. So what I do is I measure over here and I find a good, take the tape and go straight up. You don't want to have it on an angle back here or an angle over here. You want to have it pretty much straight up. And an easy number that I can see, sorry, I'm a retard, there we go, is 27 inches. So I'm going to draw a line. It's going to start, I'm just going to put a number right here that says 27. So that's 27 inches. So that means if I want it 1.5 inches lower, I'm shooting for 25.5 inches. So whatever that number is, just write it down. And then what we're going to have to do is we're going to leave all this back together, but I'm going to have to take off the seat, the side covers, and I'm going to have to take the shock off, and you have to remove the spring on your shock, okay? So let me do all that off camera. You guys know how to do that. I'm going to take the shock off, remove the spring, and then I'm going to put the shock back on the bike. Okay, you with me? Whoa, wait. I need to mention one thing here real quick. You have to take all your subframe off, your exhaust off and everything. It doesn't take very long to do that. It intimidates people, but it's no big deal to get to your shock, okay? Once your shock is off and you've removed your spring, then you just slip it back in. You don't have to do up the bolts completely on the top. I don't know if you can see in the bottom there. You don't have to thread them all the way in and put their nuts on them. You just have to locate the shock. And you want to make sure your shock shaft is clean, because we're going to put a little piece of tape around there. And you'll see in just a minute. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put the subframe back on. Not for final, just put the bolts in it so it's located right so we can take our measurement. And then we're going to put blocks underneath the rear wheel to get it up 1.5 inches, okay? Okay, now that the subframe's back on, it's pretty stable. What we have to do, now there's no spring on there, but there is nitrogen still in the bladder, so it's going to push the shock open. So we have to compress the suspension a little bit to get what we want, at 25.5 inches. Now, the way I did it before, I just used a simple strap, motorcycle strap, and you can go through your wheel, just around your subframe somewhere like this, and simply tighten it up. And then what I did is I just got in like this, I kind of lifted while I tightened the strap to take a measurement. So right there, we're measuring 25 3/8. It's a little bit more than I wanted, so I'm just going to loosen this a little. Check it again. 25 1/2, right on the money. So now that I'm 25 1/2 inches, what I got to do is mark the shaft of the shock where that is. Now I'll bring you in here a little closer, but this shock shaft is going in a little bit to make that out here compress to 25 1/2 inches. So if I use some masking tape, I can simply wrap it around the shock shaft all the way up against the dust cover, all the way up. So when you take it all off and that extends back out, you can take a measurement. That measurement will correspond to how many shims you have to put in there, which will translate to 25 1/2 inches out here. So I'll just take that. It's tough to do with gloves on here, but I'll do my best. Forget it. Take a little piece of masking tape, or use black electrical tape, whatever you want. You're just going to reach in here. I'll show you here in just a second. You're going to put that right up against the shock shaft. Sticks very nicely. And you know, that's how far you want that shock shaft to open. To lower the back the amount you're looking for. Okay, so you can see that. That's the shock shaft in there. Right here is the tape I put around the shock shaft. So once I take it all apart, I'll show you what the and it's going to open back up again. There's going to be a gap between the top of that tape and the dust cover. And that's going to tell us how many shims we need to put in there. So I'm going to go ahead, sorry I'm shaking, I'm holding out there. Now I'm going to take it all apart, take the shock off, and I'll show you how we measure it. Okay, here's the shock removed from the bike. As you can see, this is where we had the tape applied, and when the back of the bike was raised 1 1/2 inches, that was tight, was up like this. Once I released everything, boom, it went down to that. So now what we have to do is measure that gap, and we want to put shims inside of here to stop the shaft from opening up more than where that tape is at. Okay, so now let's, by the way, on this bike, here's the shim stack, or not the shim stack, basically the spacer kit that we're going to use. First things first, we got to measure the distance between the shock dust cover and the tape. And it's exactly 10 millimeters. It's 1 centimeter. Okay, 10 millimeters. Now what we need to do is we need to open up. And by the way, there's instructions that come in these kits. If you forget all this stuff, you can read the instructions. For me, it's always easier if I see it. But you have all kinds of different combinations of spacers here. Different widths. The little skinny ones, wide ones. You basically put these combinations together until you get to the thickness that you want. Mine's 10 millimeters, so if I put 2 of these big ones, that's 6. So let's go with the next big one. You want the least amount you can. That's 9. I'm gonna have to go with a real thin one here, probably. That's 11. So I might have to get rid of one of these thick ones and use 2 thin ones. Okay, there we go, 10, right on the money. or just a hair under 10. I've got, let's see measure what these are. I've got 2 that are 3s, 3 millimeters wide, so that makes 6, and each of these are 2 millimeters wide. Oh, I better get that, guys. Hang on a minute. Okay, so now the process is, now that we know we need 10 millimeters of spacing, we can rip this off, and now we got to take this shock apart. Now, you guys have seen other videos where I've done that. I really don't want to take the time to do that in this video, so if you look back at some of my other videos, you'll see shock disassembly, but I'll just talk about it briefly. You take, there's little half moon shaped voids in the side of this dust cover. You take a small punch, 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 this pops off. Right here is the nitrogen chamber. It's got a little Schrader valve. You let the air out of it. And then you push this down, and there'll be a clip ring in there. So there's a little centerpiece right here that holds the bladder together. You push that down. There's a clip ring in there. You pop out. I've got a special tool that threads on here. You can get another Schrader valve cap, use pliers or something, pull it out. And then in here, you're going to have what's called a seal head. And there's a ring, a clip ring that holds that in, so you have to push it down a little bit, pop that clip ring out, and then you take this shaft and pull it out. Now most of the time the piston on this thing is brutal tight, so sometimes you have to slide this up like this. You have to hold it with your hand and take a rubber dead blow hammer and tap, pat, pat. Don't use anything with metal on it. Plastic you can get away with, and rubber. But nothing harder than that, because this is aluminum. You'll just beat the crap out of it. So just a rubber mallet, bam, 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 bam. Flip it over, bam, 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 bam. And you just keep doing that until it comes out, and the shock oil will go everywhere. But then you can clean it all up. And I'm gonna take it apart and then show you where we're gonna put the shims and how to get them on there, okay? So hang tight. Okay guys, sorry I forget where I am. We just had some family stop by and visit for a couple hours. Always good to sit down and visit with family when you can, you know. Take that time when you can. Alright, so back here to the shock. The shock is disassembled. This is the clevis, attaches to the lower linkage. This is your bumper. This is the dust cover. This is what is called the seal head. That's where all your internal seals are to keep your shock oil from coming out. This is your piston, and then you've got the compression valving, rebound valving, and the nut. This is your shock body, and this shock stuff all fits inside like this, okay? Now, what limits the opening, this seal head right here has a little groove. You'll see, maybe you can see right in the top right here, there's a clip ring groove where this little clip ring goes in. Sorry. This little clip ring right here goes inside the shock body. There's a groove. Can't see it, but it's right in here. There's a little groove. And when you put all this stuff back in there, this seal head goes inside, past the groove, then you put this clip in the groove, and then you pull it back out, and it seats up against the seal head. That's what stops it from coming out. So what happens is when the shock opens up, it goes this way, whoop, boom, until it hits the bottom of this plate. And there's a little rubber bumper right here. You see that black rubber bumper, hits that plate, and that's what stops the shock from opening any further. And if you remember, we want the shock to not open up as far so that the suspension will stay lowered, so that 10mm change that we wanted to make with these little spacers right here needs to go between this little plate right here and the rubber bumper. And you'll notice that the center hole is large. I think this is 14, maybe it's 16mm shaft. I think it's 14. Let me just measure it real quick. Oh, it's 16. So the diameter of this shaft is 16mm, and these spacers have a hole in the middle to allow them to go over that 16mm shaft between the seal head and this plate. And once that's in there, then what's going to happen is this is going to open up and it's going to hit those little plastic spacers and stop the opening, and that's what limits the opening of the shock and limits how it lowers the bike. Does that make sense? So what we're going to do, you've seen it in my other videos before, this little nut right here is peened on. I have to take my grinder and I have to grind an angle, about a 45-degree angle on this nut and shock shaft to grind the peening off. And then I'm going to take this nut and take it off. I'm going to take all these parts off and put the spacers on right here, okay? You see me do that in other videos, so I'm not going to take the time to do it. Just to review, grind this nut, 45-degree angle around the whole thing, back the nut off, keep all this stuff together. You can use a zip tie or something to pull it off. You can slide the spacers on. You're going to put all this stuff back on, put this nut down, and re-torque it with some blue Loctite. Okay, I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. Okay, I know it's kind of hard to see with all this stuff in the back, but this is what the nut should look like after you're done grinding. I'm lazy, as you guys know, so I used my grinder. And then I take a file to kind of clean up these edges a little bit, and then I'll put my wrench on there to break it loose. So you have to grind it on an angle, but you don't want to damage the center. You want to make sure that the center of that hole stays completely untouched. So you have a little bit of a, I don't know if you can kind of see, a little bit of an edge around that hole. Okay, so I'm going to break that loose. I'm going to take this off and put the spacers on. Okay, here you can see the completed stack in here. There's that group of little shims right there, 10mm. You can see if I hold the seal head in place and straighten out, pull out the shock, it's going to stop the shock from opening past that 10mm. That's going to shorten the shock. And as a result of shortening the shock, that's going to reduce how far the suspension opens, and that lowers the bike. So now we're going to reinstall this back in the shock body, bleed it properly, recharge it with nitrogen. This particular bike I do 156 psi or pounds per square inch of nitrogen. Your shock may have something different, so you want to look up in your specs, and you can look in my previous videos for how to bleed a shock and how to assemble it, so we don't have to take the time to do it here. Okay, so this is what the final shock looks like with the spring back on. One thing I want you to kind of be aware of, we've shortened this shock a little bit, but the nice thing is there's enough threads on the shock body that when you put the spring back on, your spring is going to move up, but you don't have to buy a new spring because you simply install it, and the threads on this lock collar will be higher up on the threaded part of the body. Normally it's down in here a little bit, but because there's enough threads, you can just simply loosen the lock nuts and the spring can fit up higher on the shock body, so you don't have to buy a shorter spring when you do the rear like you do the front. So I've just put a little bit of preload. I'm going to have to set the sag with these boys when I actually get them up on the bike. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the shock back in the bike and put the subframe back on, and then we're going to take a measurement to see how close we are. If we're pretty close, I'm going to be happy with it. It may be right on the money. We'll see. Okay, so the shock's back on, the subframe is back on. Now we're going to take a measurement. Our goal was 25.5, or really close to that. We're going to measure here. And our measurement is 25 and 9/16. 1/16 of an inch off, but that's close enough. So basically, that's how you do it.